Assalamu alaikum, fam. Hope you're doing fantastic. So we're in the 9th article of St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. And it is whether Holy Scripture should use metaphors. Now, this is a topic I always find really informative because as someone like me, who, I don't know, our brains are more philosophically lined, metaphors, allegory, symbolism, all those types of things really help the common person and others to really understand deeper concepts. And a lot of very woke atheists sometimes lack the ability to understand metaphors and therefore are unable to understand revelations of any holy text because they look at it just purely literal, like they would a chemistry book or something. And that is where you get to the big differences in the mindset of a smug militant atheist and somebody who is more spiritual in a sense. Not spiritual to where they're so idealist and utopian that their brain has exited this planet, but not like a guru or somebody, but there's a difference between a wise elder and somebody who is babbling nonsense, right? So this metaphor topic is going to be highly valuable for all students of theology, I'd argue. So let's begin. We proceed thus to the 9th article. Objection 1. It seems that Holy Scripture should not use metaphors, for that which is proper to the lowest science seems not to befit this science, which holds the highest place of all, but to proceed by the aid of various similitudes, and figure is proper to poetry, the least of all the sciences. It calls poetry the least of all the sciences. Therefore it is not fitting that this science should make use of such similitudes. Alright, he says no. Let's see what our boy Aquinas says. Poetry makes use of metaphors to produce a representation. Exactly. I mean, that's very spot on, and Aquinas says. It's very true. Poetic representation utilizes metaphors to bring forth understanding, I argue. For it is natural to man to be pleased with representations. But sacred doctrine makes use of metaphors as both necessary and useful. So that's pretty interesting. So Catholic doctrine agrees that metaphors are necessary and useful because humans have a natural inclination to be pleased with representations, whether that be poetic verse or such. Still, whether a poetic metaphor or just a plain metaphor. So very interesting reply he gives. Objection 2. Further, this doctrine seems to be intended to make truth clear. Hence a reward is held out to those who manifest it. They that explain me shall have life everlasting. Ecclesiastes, I think he annotated it in the Latin way, XXIV 31. But such similitudes, truth is obscured. Therefore, to put forward divine truths by likening them to corporal things does not befit the science. Ooh, this is a difficult one. Saying that similitudes veiled through corporal, poetic metaphors actually obscures them. Interesting. Let's see how he replies. Alright. The ray of reply objection 2. The ray of divine revelation is not extinguished by the sensible imagery wherewith it is veiled. Look at that language. So divine rays of revelation. Think of how he's using this light metaphor even in his own response. So ray of light not getting distinguished even though sensible imagery is being utilized. It will not be veiled, especially to someone who uses human reason or is able to understand poetic metaphor utilization, right? As Dionysius says, and its truth so far remains that it does not allow the minds of those to whom the revelation has been made to rest in the metaphors, but raises them to the knowledge of its truth. Aha! So you won't rest in metaphors, but instead you will contemplate and therefore raise your level of consciousness to understand the truth embedded therein, you see? And through those to whom the revelation has been made, others also may receive instruction in these matters. Yes, so others who maybe don't, maybe they are more creatively inclined and they are able to understand certain things. Hence those things that are taught metaphorically in one part of the scripture and other parts are taught more openly. So here he's telling you the different ways in which things can be taught in scripture. More open, yet more metaphorically, which I think that if you have a student of knowledge and you want to elucidate something to them, I think employing both forms is a way to keep the class dynamic, but to also impart knowledge that can be expressed in various ways, I'd argue. The very hiding of truth in figures is useful for the exercise of thoughtful minds. Yes, I agree. I totally agree with that. And as a defense against the ridicule of the impious. Very true. I mean, you gotta think about it. That's a good point. According to the words, give not that which is holy to dogs. Matthew vi 6. You know, you want to be plain and to the point and have utilizations of words, no doubt. But you can put things towards a higher, more metaphorical, poetic sense to get the kind of blunt, backwards, vapidly vain, smug atheists, right, who don't really want to understand. So, like, it goes over their head and they'll bark, but for people who actually are thoughtful and want to use their minds in a more layered perspective and approach, will benefit therefrom. So, using metaphors is permissible, right? Does not take away. Very potent. Objection 3. Further, the higher creatures are the nearer they approach to the divine likeness. If therefore any creature be taken to represent God, this representation ought chiefly to be taken from the higher creatures, and not from the lower. Yet this is often found in the scriptures. I would disagree. Someone who's a Muslim, nothing is comparable to Allah, so I would not compare any creature, nothing of the creation, to the Maker. But this is a Catholic text, so it appears that it is permissible for them. Let's see how he justifies it. As Dionysius says, Locke sit, it is more fitting that divine truth should be expounded under the figure of less noble or nobler bodies. That's interesting. And this is for 3 reasons. Firstly, because thereby men's minds are the better preserved from error. So he argues, the Dionysius person, that the divine truths actually, if they're expounded with this sort of poetic delivery, or at least metaphoric delivery, they'll actually have less error instead of more error. So remember how in the other objection it was, oh well, it clouds it, it makes it more obscure. He's arguing actually it preserves it from error. Very interesting. For then it is clear that these things are not literal descriptions of divine truths. So again, here he's saying, when you use metaphors, you're not speaking literal. So if, smug atheist comes to you and is trying to just say logic and particles and other nonsense, you're like, okay, well, you're not even attempting to understand metaphor at all, right? Which might have been open to doubt had they been expressed under the figure of noble bodies, especially for those who could think of nothing nobler than bodies. Interesting. So really getting into the human mind's capability there. They can't think of anything nobler than those bodies, so you have to speak in a way where they can understand you based on their human understanding, their human reason. But you gotta, sounds like you have certain people who you could minister to in that way, and others who you can go for a higher route, but not every student is the same. Secondly, because this is more befitting the knowledge of God that we have in this life. For what he is not is clearer to us than what he is. Aha! That's a good point. Look at that. So, what he is not is more clear than what he is. So, essentially saying, from a Catholic perspective, that God, we know what he's not. To say what he is a little harder to do. Therefore, similitudes drawn from things farthest away from God form within us a truer estimate that God is above whatsoever we may say or think of him. Oh, that's interesting. Because in Islam we would say, high above Allah is everything that they try to associate with him. And look what they just said in this Catholic way. An estimate that God is above whatsoever we may say or think of him. Very interesting. You see some overlap there, at least for that particular point. Thirdly, because thereby divine truths are the better hidden from the unworthy. Now, this is interesting because in the Quran, you're not supposed to hide knowledge. You're supposed to, even if you learn a small ayat, you got to teach people, right? And like hadith say. But here, I find it interesting how I have a bit of a struggle with this too. It's like you want to protect knowledge from people who are unworthy to even have it because of how they'll use it as satire and mockery. I think what's interesting is that Jewish people hide more knowledge. Christians have a bit of half and half, and then Muslims are way more open with their knowledge, at least from what I understand. And then Buddhists are kind of just like out talking to anybody, nothing's really hidden. And in Hinduism, well, there's so much work and so much stuff to learn that it's almost overwhelming, because it's just like everything is hidden because there's so much stuff to read. But it's interesting that two interesting points right there. So what do you think? Should you use metaphors? I argue yes. I agree with Aquinas that poetry is a useful representation, and that humans do have an ability to understand things that are necessary and useful through metaphor, and that some minds are actually more inclined in this way than just a literal, robotic automaton, wannabes of Sam Harris types, right? Even they can't even read a chemistry book with such enthusiasm, but then will mock something that has a higher sense. So, again, he argues further, don't forget, that divine revelation doesn't get extinguished by sensible imagery. It's not going to be overly veiled to the point of obscurity, that it actually will help you understand and receive better instructions based on your own understanding as well. And you'll be able to impart knowledge more effectively of the scripture to people if you actually know how to even utilize metaphors as well. So again, Aquinas hitting us with the knowledge. It's very beneficial to study other doctrines. Also gives me an idea on how I would want to write a book from an Islamic perspective, how I would organize rebuttals against armchair atheists. But again, very valuable. Hope you enjoy.